My guest today is Jon Benjamin. Jon is the British ambassador to Mexico, and throughout his 35-year diplomatic career, he has represented the United Kingdom in a range of countries, including Chile, Ghana, Turkey, Indonesia, and the United States. In addition, Jon also uses his considerable platform on Twitter to speak out against anti-Semitism. Jon, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. It's actually 36 years. I'm not proud to say that, but there you go. And I hope you're going to liberally advertise my Twitter handle during this interview.
The plan was every 5 minutes we were going to just mention it.
Yeah.
Now,
That's
my first question to you is, being a Jewish diplomat who has lived around the world, a lot of people may be curious as to your impressions of how anti-Semitism manifests differently in different places and how Jews are perceived in different places. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah. First of all, I'm a British diplomat, first and foremost, who happens to be Jewish, right? So it's important to put that in perspective. There's not a simple blanket answer because my experience of anti-Semitism around the world, it varies so hugely. It has something to do with whether there is or isn't a Jewish community in the country concerned, right? So early on, I was posted to Indonesia. There are effectively no Jewish people in Indonesia. I've been in other countries where the Jewish minority is very small, such as in Turkey. And there is always a difference between whether people are basing whatever views they have, favorable or negative, on personal interaction or a kind of more abstract notion of a people or religion, an ethnic group, however they define it, which they don't actually interact with themselves. And then, of course, there's so many other factors which makes it impossible to give a blanket answer. So, for example, in Chile, Chile is host to the largest Palestinian origin community in the world outside the Middle East itself. 300,000 to 400,000 maybe Chileans who define themselves as Palestinian origin. Of course, I'm sure this will come up in the interview, perceptions of Israel, of the Israel-Palestine issue, of the Middle East in general, also have a lot to do with how Jewish people are perceived in various parts of the world. So that might not be a very precise answer, but it does mean that it just varies so much from country to country that it's impossible to generalize.
Yeah. You touched upon Israel there, and in May of last year, during Israel's conflict with the terrorist group Hamas, we saw spikes in anti-Semitism across the world, and certainly in the United States and Britain. Everyday Jews were targeted during this. And according to the international definition of anti-Semitism, it is anti-Semitic to blame Jews for the actions of the Israeli state. And I'm wondering whether you noticed a difference in whether this happens in some countries more than others.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I don't think that's a new phenomenon. I think if I look back over many years, there's always a spike of anti-Semitism when there is a spike in the conflict between Israel and Hamas or Hezbollah, or in the Intifada periods. There's always some sort of relationship, probably causal. It's always difficult to prove these things. So that's the first thing to say. I don't think that the most recent example is particularly new. And again, it varies around the world, right? So it depends a bit on how invested countries and governments and their people are in the Israel-Palestine issue, how near or how remote that seems. It does vary. I should have added that here, I'm very struck here in Mexico that I've met a couple of times with the leaders of the Jewish community, whose central organization, interestingly, is called the Central Committee, which reminds me of being in East Germany in the early 80s, as if you're dealing with a Politburo or something like that. But that's how they call themselves. And they themselves say that they think the Jewish community here in Mexico may be 40 to 50,000 strong in terms of its size, suffers less anti-Semitism than any other sizable Jewish community almost anywhere in the world. Doesn't mean there's none. And again, it can be linked to what's going on in the Middle East itself. But it was very pleasing to me in my first meeting with them to hear them say that, broadly speaking, they don't suffer huge kind of waves of anti-Semitism.
Now, I'm also curious about how anti-Semitism is tackled from country to country in terms of policy, and which ones, in your opinion, have got it right, and which ones maybe need a bit of improvement.
Again, hard to generalize. I think in Europe, there's always, wherever you're talking about, there's always a difference between what the statute book says and its implementation. I mean, not just in this field, in almost every field imaginable. So that's often an issue. Can be not the lack of legislation, but how and whether it's effectively implemented. I think in Europe, under the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, there's a very good set of laws, frameworks, nationally and continent-wide, in terms of dealing with all forms of racism and discrimination. And I do myself put anti-Semitism firmly in that panoply of prejudices and discriminatory views and activities. And so the legal framework in Europe is very, very strong. It has a lot of historical resonance for obvious reasons. So the framework is strong. So it's about what action is taken and whether that action is consistent. And then, of course, you stray into a subject which is very contemporary about free speech. What are the limits of free speech? My Twitter feed is full of people sounding off about Elon Musk and Twitter and free speech, right? So, and of course, in the US, there's a more liberal, if you like, approach to free speech. It's a bit more absolute than it tends to be in the UK. So, and in Europe, so laws we have about sending people to jail for hate speech, of which there are many examples in UK and more widely in Europe. The bar is higher in the US. So I think the debate about what are the limits of free speech, should you tolerate hate speech as part of free speech, or if not, where do you draw the line? I think that's a very active and very live debate, which Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter has put right back there front and center again. Again, there's no easy answer. It's about the societal and political appetite for clamping down on manifestations of racism and prejudice versus one of the hallmarks of our society is to basically allow people to say what they want, right? Which I'm broadly very supportive of.
Yeah.
And I don't think that debate's going to ever come to a conclusion. You'll never be able to say it's settled, but it is evolving, and it is front and center of our own political debate right now.
Yeah. Now, as mentioned, you do use your considerable Twitter platform, which, by the way, for the listeners, is it at? Please remind me. John.
Yeah,
it's at Jon
it's at Jon Benjamin 19. There's no H in John. In fact, there's a Jon Benjamin who I think is also Jewish in the States, who's a kind of comic actor and voice actor, who's much more famous than I am, and I sometimes get some interesting messages directed at him and vice versa. But there you are. But mine is at Jon Benjamin 19 with no H.
Right, and it has the echo around it, the 3 brackets on each side.
Yeah, I decided to put that in. I do define myself as Jewish, amongst other things, in my own Twitter bio. I'm not sure how much of a thing that still is. It had its moment a few years ago.
Yeah, let's explain what that means, but for those who don't know.
Yeah, as far as I know, the 3 brackets around names originally was a far right kind of neo-Nazi thing to identify Jewish people without saying so. And as I think is often pretty effective, if you take over the symbols used by others,
Yeah.
it can be an effective way of disarming them, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way, I remember in my misspent youth in the 70s, for a while, our own flag, the Union Jack, became kind of hijacked by far right groups, right? And it was important to claim it back for what it is. So it's an example of using symbols misused by others to kind of either reclaim them, or in this case of the three brackets, to try and defang them. However, it may be time to remove them, in that I haven't really heard that being an issue so much recently.
Yeah. Well, I don't want you to remove them, and then as soon as you remove it, they're like, now he started again. Now on
Yeah.
your on your Twitter platform, you speak out a lot about anti-Semitism, and I'm wondering, when did you first become interested in fighting anti-Semitism?
Well, I have to say it's more recent. You will, and your viewers will understand, I'm not going to get into British domestic politics. I'm not allowed to, and I don't want to. My job as a senior civil servant rightly prevents me from opining. However, it is a fact that I most got into. It's always interested me as a subject. Religion in general interested me as a subject, even as I'm not religious. But specifically, anti-Semitism came more onto my radar a few years ago, and particularly from about 2017, I was living back in the UK and in London for the first time in about 14 years. And for reasons that are well known, it became a subject of public debate, and I became involved in it. Now, I have, and I'm proud of having, friends and contacts from right across the political spectrum in the UK, without becoming involved in a party political sense myself. I'm not allowed to because of my job, but it's not as if I didn't have this job, I'd suddenly rush to become a member of a political party. Believe me, I wouldn't. I feel quite politically neutral beyond the confines of my job. But it is a subject I've discussed right across the political spectrum. And I think these subjects do need to be aired and to be discussed, rather than avoided. But I'm quite happy to use my platform to call out egregious anti-Semitic statements or acts. And of course, identifying as Jewish, sometimes I'm on social media, I'm the subject of that myself. Most often, of course, from anonymous sounding accounts where you can't really identify who's behind it.
Yes, they have an egg for their avatar or something.
Yeah, that sort of thing. But it's a subject that, yes, I've become particularly interested in. And of course, it's been the work of a decade or more. But as you said, I've got quite a large following across several social media platforms, primarily Twitter. And I do call out quite clear anti-Semitism when I see it.
Yeah. Has the anti-Semitism that you've experienced been restricted solely to online, or have you experienced it in real life?
It's very largely online. A couple of times in real life, I've had people say things, perhaps even that they thought were well-intentioned, but which I thought were pretty objectionable. I've also had the kind of wryly amusing experience of meeting in real life people who I've seen either directly or indirectly on social media. And as so often is the case, people won't say things or don't say things in real life that they feel happier expressing in what they think is cyberspace. That couple of times that's happened has been quite amusing. But for me, it's predominantly been an online phenomenon. But of course, using the same platforms, I follow lots of sites and observe what's going on more widely.
Yeah. I'm wondering, growing up, What did your Jewish upbringing look like, and do you think it influenced your world view at all?
Yeah, it was a very kind of liberal reform upbringing. I got as far as being bar mitzvahed. My personal journey since then is I've become less and less religious. I define myself as a humanist, so I'm somewhere between agnostic and atheist. One of the things I love about Judaism is you're allowed to be very questioning and doubtful and doubting and still be accepted as being Jewish. For me, many years later, when I lived in New York, as running the British consulate there, this is now over 15 years ago. I did try and reconnect, New York being such a Jewish city, of course, in many ways, and I had lots and lots of discussions with a rabbi I got to know well on a kind of religious, theological, spiritual basis. But I'm afraid I didn't come back into the fold religiously, if you like, philosophically, religiously. I'm a humanist, as I said. Interestingly, when I look back, when it was from a very young age, it was always my ambition to join the British diplomatic service, and it was parts of my wider Jewish family, obviously, who were one or two who were somewhat discouraging, saying you'll never get in there. They had what I consider to be incorrect and outmoded views of the Foreign Office itself as somehow having anti-Semitic elements in it, and they told me you won't get in, they won't take you, they won't accept you, which kind of bolstered my motivation to join, along with my careers officer at the University of Surrey in Guildford, where I studied, who told me, perhaps doing exactly the opposite of what a careers officer is supposed to do, that I had no hope and no chance of getting into the Foreign Office, not being Oxbridge or public school, as he said at the time. So those two elements really just redoubled my determination to join up. And I've after 36 years, I can't imagine what else I would have done. I'm very glad I did.
Yeah. That you mentioned something interesting. What was your family saying about, what were their perceptions of the Foreign Office and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it wasn't my immediate family who were always very, very encouraging. But I'm talking a few cousins, uncles, aunts, that sort of thing. Oh, I think they had a perception, and that wasn't unique to them, of course, of the Foreign Office being kind of pro-Arabist, basically. A lot of people at the top of the Foreign Office who'd studied Arabic and went down that route. But it was a bit vague. It was a bit ill-informed. I mean, in the Foreign Office itself, I haven't experienced anti-Semitism. I'm now fairly senior in it myself, of course, but as a junior diplomat coming up, that's never been my experience. And of course, professional diplomats look at the Middle East in a very kind of geostrategic way, based on their own perception of our national interest, as they do around the world. But that perception that the Foreign Office had elements of anti-Semitism was quite strong in the 1980s amongst Jewish people, I found, when I joined themselves. And of course, one or two of them were a bit flabbergasted when I actually got in.
You mentioned that you were stationed in New York for a while.
Yeah.
And what was that like, especially your relationship with the Jewish community there?
Yeah, well, professionally, it was very interesting, because working also with the political section in our embassy in Washington, one of my roles there was to be the British government's link person to Jewish organizations, not because I'm Jewish, but because it went with the job description. And of course, there's this complete alphabet soup of dozens of Jewish organizations in New York that are either New York focused or national, but based there, including more than one organization with exactly the same acronym, I seem to remember, just to add to the confusion. So I had a lot to do with the kind of organized Jewish community there, from ADL, APAC, and down to Z. I'm sure there was some beginning with Z also for obvious reasons, and lots in between. It was fascinating to me to see the politics, to talk to Jewish groups across the spectrum, from left to right, from Zionist to anti-Zionist, and every shade in between. Often, of course, fishing in the same pool of potential donors, which made it quite competitive, I think, amongst themselves at times. But also seeing the way they organized and their lobbying effort in Washington. And of course, I was there when Hillary Clinton was elected senator, for example, in New York, and to see the way that the Jewish community interests plus the Middle East, the Israel factor played into elections was tremendously interesting to observe as well. So it was completely fascinating professionally and personally. Yeah.
So you were there when Hillary Clinton was elected senator. So was this around 2000?
Yeah, and a bit after. So she was a very prominent figure. Of course, the politics of the Jewish community in New York were fundamental. Also because of my job, and we were still then, of course, in the latter part of my posting, we were still in the early years after 9/11 and so on. And part of my job was also interacting with New York's Muslim communities. And I use it deliberately in the plural because, of course, in New York, the Muslim community was from so many different heritages and national origins, and so many different viewpoints. And being in the early post 9/11 era, that kind of working with communities, seeing best practice, comparing that with what we were doing in the UK. Was quite fundamental to our job. So it's a completely fascinating viewpoint. In fact, I've got what sounds like the first line of a joke, because we had a parliamentary delegation from the UK, and I was with them in a mosque in Brooklyn, and I started feeling unwell during the dinner that the community laid on for us. I got progressively worse. I ended up going to hospital, but the doctors there told me there's nothing wrong with me, sent me away again. The next morning, feeling only slightly better, I was with them, this time in a synagogue, having breakfast with one part of the Jewish community. And they rang me up from the hospital to say the doctor in the night had missed something and had to come back immediately. So I had to rush off and have my appendix out. So,
oh my God.
Being in a mosque and then a synagogue and ending up with my appendix being removed all in the space of about barely 12 hours was one of the reasons I remember that period so well.
What a trip.
Yeah, it certainly was in all senses.
Yeah, well, that sort of leads me on to my next question, which is, for those travelers who are looking to have a memorable time, hopefully in a good way, what advice would you give for people looking to travel and explore the world, whether that's in Mexico or any of the other countries you've been to?
Well, I think the easy answer is yes. I'd encourage everyone to do that. It broadens your horizons. It teaches you different viewpoints. In my case, several languages. It makes you see your own country with different eyes, also slightly when you come back. And of course, we're now in a period after 2 years of pandemic where there's this really pent up desire to get out there and enjoy life again. And I think traveling has always been part of that for me. With a UK passport, most of the world is open to you. It's one of the passports with the least requirement for visas in different countries around the world. Certainly here in Mexico, you can just hop on a plane and come over. It's very easy. So absolutely, and I'm very glad to have a son who's himself bilingual, multilingual, very internationally focused. He's not yet 10 and he's lived in 4 different countries.
Oh my
I
gosh.
think I think traveling is the best antidote to being narrow-minded or prejudiced yourself, just by amassing lots of different experiences. But of course, I'm very fortunate and lucky to have a job that allows me to do that professionally.
Hello, thank you very much for watching. If you're enjoying this interview, please like the video below and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode of Podcast Against Antisemitism. Now, back to the podcast. It's an interesting observation that you made, that traveling can sort of combat narrow-mindedness and actually combat prejudice. What about traveling would actually help that?
Well, it's not the traveling itself, it's the destination and the interaction with people from so many different cultures and languages. I mean, I've been lucky, I've been posted on every continent now. You see there are so many ways of looking at the world. There's so many things we have in common too, in our basic humanity and our basic desire for stability and protection, safety, basic freedoms, and so on. And I'm sure if I just stayed in one place in London, I never got that. For all that, one of the things I most love about London is it's one of the world's most diverse cities. The comparison is often made with New York, of course, and I've been lucky to have the experience of living in New York. I think London is a more successfully diverse city than New York, in the sense that that both London and New York share that statistic of something like 40% or just under of all its inhabitants having been born not only outside the city but in another country. But I think in London, the diverse groups, ethnic groups, national groups interact much more, certainly socially, than they do in New York, was my impression anyway when I lived there. So London's a great place to be for, a great city to live in, to get a lot of different perspectives. But traveling, well, not the traveling, but the arriving in other countries and then living in them, as I've done for years at a time, does, I think, give everyone and myself a different set of insights into how people just very genuinely think differently around the world.
Right. Now, speaking of London, those who follow you on Twitter at Jon Benjamin 19 will know that you are a supporter of West Ham Football Club. And last year, Campaign Against Antisemitism publicized a video that went viral on social media. And that video showed a group of West Ham fans on a plane directing verbal abuse at a religious Jewish man, which resulted in 3 arrests and 2 suspensions so far. As a Jewish West Ham fan yourself, what was your reaction to this incident?
Yeah, so my family heritage is from the East End, right? I mean, if you certainly, my mother's father was a refugee from Eastern Europe, but there's a long family heritage in the UK in the East End. So hence why a lot of most of the family support either West Ham or Leyton Orient. But you can't watch Leyton Orient on the telly, sadly, so quite so often. So when I saw that incident, I wasn't that surprised. Of course, I was dismayed. I think it's not unique to West Ham. When I was a teenager, I followed West Ham home and away for a couple of seasons. You used to get up at 3:30 in the morning to go to Newcastle or Huddersfield or wherever it was, and so was part of that. And there sadly, then in the 70s, there was a lot of racism. I think the racism amongst the West Ham kind of ultras towards black people, Asian people, was as bad or worse than it was towards Jewish people. It came out a lot in the games against Tottenham, of course, the Y word and all that sort of stuff. What I was pleased about, however, was that West Ham as a club took immediate action. It banned those people who could be identified from the video of that plane. It reported them to the police. And I think football clubs have to give an example. They have to pass out exemplary punishment for all sorts of racism, I think, that you see in the terraces. But a club can't be held 100% totally responsible for the action of all its fans. You're talking about adults, responsible adults, or irresponsible in that case. and ultimately each individual is responsible for their own and accountable for their own actions. So I think what they did at a club level when that video came out, and including working with Tottenham Hotspur over the controversy about songs that are sung at those games, I think that at a club level, I think they did the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, anti-Semitism in football is not new, and it's certainly not limited to the UK either. I mean, we've also seen this in the Netherlands. There was an anti-Semitic mural directed to one of their players, and as well as chants. We've also seen this in Berlin with their football clubs. And I'm wondering if you've noticed this, or what your feelings are on anti-Semitism in football around the world.
Yeah, no, not. I haven't noticed it hugely. I mentioned Chile. There's one team that's called Palestina, and again with its roots in the very large Palestinian community in Chile, but it's not a major feature, and hooliganism does happen right around the world. In fact, arguably, it happens less in the UK now than in many other places, and certainly a world away from what it was like, as I recall, in the late 70s and early 80s. So the anti-Semitism aspect of football, I think, it's important to put it in proportion. It was a very, I mean, I look back with horror at just witnessing in the late 70s at West Ham and at other grounds, you know, the monkey noises that fans would make at black players. Of course, no action was taken against the perpetrators at the time. I've got some good friends in the football world, including some prominent black players. Leroy Orsini is a good friend. He used to play for West Ham, and we hosted his book launch in Ghana when I was there as High Commissioner. And of course, he tells the story of what it was like, what that sort of racism was like in the football world for him when he was breaking through. It's completely shocking, and yet at the time it didn't create the disgust that it should have done, or the action against it that it should have done. And we've learned and progressed since then, but unfortunately that's crept back since as well, hasn't it? Look at the abuse that the black players in the England team took after the final, the penalty shootout against Italy last year.
Yeah.
It's a work in progress always, and it's important people speak out against it. And bringing it back to, you know, the subject of anti-Semitism, what I think is really important is that, and I've made this point to people in politics right across the spectrum, it's very easy to criticize the racism or the prejudice of your political opponents. It's much harder and much braver, but also much more consistent to do so amongst people of your same politics or same party or same part of the political spectrum. And I think right across the board, maybe there are too few people who do that, who call it out when it is when it appears amongst the ranks of people who otherwise they generally are politically aligned with. So we, as Jewish people, we've got to call out anti-black racism. We've got to call out Islamophobia, and also reasonably expect that people from other minority groups do so when they see flagrant anti-Semitism. Otherwise, there's an unfortunate. You see this in Twitter. There's an unfortunate kind of misplaced notion of a competition of who's the bigger victim and who suffers more abuse. But instead, it's easy for Jewish people to call out anti-Semitism. Well, it's an obvious thing for Jewish people to do. It's an obvious thing for black people to call out racism that they suffer. It's more difficult, but also more eye-catching when people do it across whichever group or whichever politics they themselves are a member of. And I think, you know, we've got into this discussion from the football perspective, and it applies right across the board.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, you're going back to Twitter for a second. how important in 2022 do you think it is that people utilize their online platform specifically when calling out anti-Semitism and racism?
Well, it's pretty important because certainly, I mean, I'm here. I am dabbling in social media, and I'm 60 years old. For much younger people, it is the main way they communicate. Perhaps in many cases, the only way they communicate. So that's why those platforms are so important to call out anti-Semitism, to call out all manifestations of racism. And some of those manifestations are on those same platforms. So calling out people when they do it is important as well. But it's where the action's at, right? I mean, it's amazing to me when I was in New York and, 20 years ago, these were brand new things. And I remember discussions where people doubted that Twitter or Facebook would ever really take off. A bit like the music producer in the early 60s who told the Beatles they had no future, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And here we are, and they're highly dominant forms of communication. People don't read newspapers in the way I did as a kid, as a physical presence in your hand and reading from cover to cover. Not fewer and fewer people do that. These are other ways of communicating. If you want to be part of the debate, whether it's about anti-Semitism or anything else, you've got to be present on those platforms.
Right. Now, say someone does want to be part of the debate, and they have good intentions, they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, but they don't really know where to start, and it's sort of peeking through the curtain. It can seem a bit overwhelming. Where would you advise that someone start in their fight?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm qualified to advise, really. I mean, as we discussed earlier in our conversation, I'm very interested in and motivated about the subject of anti-Semitism, but I wouldn't regard myself as a campaigner on it or an activist. That's for other people to do, like yourselves. I think, there's two sides to social media. There's getting your own voice out there, and incidentally, professionally, every British ambassador, most diplomats are present on widely on social media, including, interestingly, very much so, another senior Jewish member of the Foreign Office, Melinda Simmons, who's has very wide name recognition now because she's our ambassador in Ukraine, and in fact, she just returned there a couple of days ago from or last week, I think, from having to leave Kiev at the start of the conflict. And she's also, I'd like to recognize Melinda's great efforts in calling out anti-Semitism as well. But as well as having a voice, a way of monitoring what else is going on. So one thing to do when you get involved in social media is work out what sites you want to follow, work out the various alert mechanisms that different platforms have, so you can see when people are speaking out. Otherwise, it's the kind of the town square, isn't it? It's the public debate. That's where it's going on, and it has a negative side. I mean, I like social media a lot, but there are also people who treat it like a sewer and spread all sorts of propaganda, disinformation, racist views, what have you, on there. It's unfortunately, I think that's just part of the deal, and it circles back to what we discussed earlier about what are the legitimate limits of free speech, and who gets to define what they are.
Right.
And it's quite a tortuous area, and a debate which will never come to a conclusion.
Yeah. Now, before we go, I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. We saw recently the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov make a very crude comparison in which he invoked an anti-Semitic myth, where he brought up where he said Hitler had Jewish blood as well, and this sparked backlash from many people. And I was wondering what your reaction was when he said this.
Yeah, well, you can read my reaction on my own Twitter feed at Jon Benjamin 19. There you go, got it in again. No H, because I called it out myself the other day. when he made that comment. Lavrov's been Russian foreign minister for a long, long time, and throughout much of the Putin era. Let's say this wouldn't have been a careless mistake. I'm pretty sure he would have known what he was saying and could have guessed what the reaction would be. And interestingly, it provoked a big backlash in Israel. And as you know, Israel had been criticized by some for not taking a clear enough stance one way or another in the Ukraine-Russia issue. I'm not sure, even just in terms of raw, crude politics, it served him very well. But a completely unacceptable statement, of course. As is, the comparisons to Nazism itself, which is just such a unique issue in human history. So I think it's incredibly unfortunate, and I join many others in condemning it.
Yeah. Jon, I really want to thank you for your time. Before we wrap up, and by the way, if people want to keep up with Jon, they can at Jon Benjamin 19. What message would you like to leave our listeners?
Yeah, the message is, I feel very, for all that we've discussed, I feel very grateful to be a British Jew, for all the ups and downs and the continued presence of anti-Semitism across the political spectrum. I think the British Jewish community, I think we're fortunate, relatively, and have long-standing roots in the UK. I'm very proud, therefore, to represent the UK. I've done professionally for 36 years. And again, stressing that's what I am, first and foremost. I'm a British diplomat, and I'm a British Jewish diplomat, but it's the Britishness that comes first for me. I'd also really reiterate what we discussed earlier, is that I think we should all be alert to anti-Semitism. It's the world's oldest extant hatred. Goes back, 2,000 years and more. However, again, to emphasize, as Jewish people calling attention to anti-Semitism and fighting against it, I think it's also incumbent on us to defend other communities who suffer from hatred and discrimination as well, so that all these different forms of racism don't just become siloed with only the victims, if you like, of each specific form of racism campaigning on it. It's much more effective if we join forces. And I think, again, with the UK and particularly London being amongst the world's most diverse places, something which I can absolutely attest to, having lived in so many countries for so long around the world, I think our diversity in the UK is very precious and very attractive. And it's something we should all contribute to, and we stand up against those who seek to undermine those values through hate speech, through hatred, through discrimination, but also do it across the lines of ethnicity, of religion, of politics, and stand up for the right values.
Jon Benjamin, thank you so much for joining Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you. And I look forward to having another chat at some point in the future.
Absolutely.